Hello ladies and gentlemen, this is Santtu Pesonen from the Santtu Pesonen Project and welcome to the final part of the making of Ex Machina. Today I'll be covering the mixing and mastering process of the upcoming EP. Enjoy! Alright, so here we are in Reaper. Got one of my projects open right here. So this project that I have open here is a song called Deception Inside, which is off of Ex Machina. Now the reason I picked this specific song for covering in this episode of the mini-series is because there is in fact, in addition to all of the other tracks, there's basically one more track, which is a piano. And I wanted to show you how I went about mixing the piano as well. Anyway, so without further ado, let's get right to it. Yep, so you can see all of the tracks here. Now, so as to save time and hard drive space, I'm not gonna play any comparisons or like any samples. But either way, if we want to start with the drums, and now when it comes to mixing, I like to keep my mixes pretty simplistic. Like there's not a fuck ton of different things going on in terms of like processing. Like pretty much the most effects that I'll have going on any track is like 4 at a definite maximum. Anyway, so if we want to start with the bass drum, so first we have an EQ here. Not a whole lot of it going on, but there's a high pass at 40 Hz, then a boost at 50 Hz, so as to bring out the low end of the bass drum, and then a high shelf at 2K. And the high pass at 40 Hz is actually something I do on almost every track, so as to cut out the nastiest low end. And then we go into a multiband compressor with some compression on the low end here. I believe at about minus 45-ish decibels. Yep, apparently. Yeah, so that's what I have going in terms of bass drum processing. Moving on to the snare drum. Here I actually have pretty much just some EQ. We have the high pass at 40 Hz, then a boost at 200 Hz, and a cut at 500 Hz. Moving on to the toms, we have the high pass at 40 Hz again. Then we have a boost at 800 Hz and a high shelf at 2500. Moving on to the hi-hats, and let's actually do the overheads as well, since it's exactly the same thing. Right, so in terms of the hi-hats and overheads, or cymbals if you want to generalize, we have the high pass around 40 Hz again, and then a high shelf at 2K. And then there's the room microphone, which, as I explained back in part 2 of this miniseries, is essentially supposed to emulate a room microphone for the drums. So it's basically a buzzed version of the entire drums, if you will. Like just a single track with all of the other tracks in it. Nope, that's not the one. There we go. Right, so with a room track, I didn't actually do any EQ whatsoever. Basically, I just slapped the reverb onto it. So you can see the settings on the screen right here that I used for the reverb on the room track. And I also set the volume on the room track relatively low as opposed to the other tracks here, so as to make the effect not too overpowering and really just subtle in a sense. Right, and moving on to the bass. Here I actually have some more things going on in regards to processing, as opposed to other tracks anyway. So we start out with an EQ. We have the usual high pass at 40 Hz, then a cut at 200 Hz, another cut at 800 Hz, and finally a low pass at 2K. Then going on into a distortion, a very subtle distortion, but it's there, and somewhat noticeable. And finally a compressor. And here you can see the settings that I used for the compressor. Right. And in regards to the guitars, I basically did the exact same processing on every guitar track. So if we want to pick this one to showcase. So again, some EQ going on here. We have a high pass at 200 Hz, then just an ever so slight boost at 400 Hz, so as to increase the peak attack, which is actually a trick I learned from Gent, surprisingly enough. And then we have a low pass at 8K. And as you can see, exact same thing with the rest of the tracks. Guitar tracks anyway. And then the vocals. So, on the vocals we start out with an EQ. 2 boosts, pretty much. One at 100 Hz, and another at 1000 Hz. So yeah, didn't even do the 40 Hz high pass on the vocals. And then it goes into a reverb. And on the screen again you can see the settings that I used for the reverb on the vocals. And now, when it comes to the vocals, there is some variation in terms of the processing, but not a whole lot. I mean, like, most of the vocal tracks do have the exact same processing going on, but on some tracks I may have drop the reverb entirely, but kept the EQ, or there might be a phaser or a chorus going on in a vocal track somewhere. But, I mean, that's the basics of the vocal processing, the signal chain. Right. And finally, the piano. Well, at least on the mixing side of things. After all, we still have the mastering to cover. But either way. So, in terms of the piano, again, not a whole lot of processing going on, just some EQ here. We have a high pass at 80 Hz, and then a boost at 1000 Hz. And there is actually some reverb on the piano track, but that was taken during the recording process, like internally from the piano. Right. Now, when it came to the mixing, I set the volume on the master relatively low to about -5 decibels. And then when it came to the mastering stage, I brought it back up to around -1.1 or -1.13 dB. Anyway, so on the mastering chain here, we start out with an EQ with just a slight high shelf at 25k. 25k, I mean 2500. Then goes into a saturator. Not a whole lot of saturation, about 25%, so it's like really subtle. Then going into a compressor, and here you can see the settings for the compressor that I used. And finally, a zero crossing maximizer. And again, settings are on the screen. And yeah, that's basically everything there is to cover in this episode. Right, so with all that, I hope you enjoyed this mini-series. And yeah, Devil Ex Machina is gonna be out sometime soon, hopefully, so look forward to that. And yeah, with that, this has been Santtu Pesonen from the Santtu Pesonen Project with the making of Devil Ex Machina.